He waited until we'd finished dinner to tell me, which I've thought about many times since, the specific cruelty of letting me enjoy a meal before taking a match to everything sitting underneath it. I think we both know this hasn't been working, he said, not quite looking at me, turning his water glass slowly in small circles on the table. I set my own fork down carefully. I didn't know that, actually. I thought things had been fine. Fine, he repeated, and something in the way he said the word made my stomach drop before he'd said anything else. Fine isn't enough anymore. I need someone who actually challenges me. Someone with direction. Someone people take seriously. I felt the shape of what was coming before he said her name, the way you feel a storm in your joints before the sky actually opens. I've been spending time with Vanessa, he said. My stepsister. I sat there, absorbing that sentence, waiting for some version of context that might make it mean something other than exactly what it meant. There wasn't one. She's ambitious, he continued, and I understood, listening to him, that he wasn't simply confessing an affair. He'd rehearsed this, the way you rehearse a business pitch, complete with supporting points. She's already being groomed to run her father's company. She has vision. She has a future people can actually see. He paused there, and I watched him choose his next words with the particular carelessness of someone who has stopped considering how words might land. You've never had any of that, he said. I think if I'm honest, I've just been waiting for you to become someone, and I don't think that person's ever coming. I need someone who isn't just useless. I didn't cry in that moment. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect tears here and I understand why, but something in me had gone very still instead, the specific stillness of finally hearing out loud in exact words a belief I suspected he'd held quietly for a long time. Useless. The word my stepmother had implied about me in 100 smaller ways for 15 years, dressed up as gentle honesty. The word my stepsister had built an entire personality around proving true. Every time she mentioned her future with the company, at family dinners while glancing sideways to make sure I'd heard. I looked at him across that table. A man I'd loved or thought I had for 3 years, and I felt something shift inside me that had nothing to do with heartbreak at all. Because he had no idea, sitting there feeling so satisfied with his honesty, that in exactly 6 days, a lawyer representing my biological father's estate was going to walk into a boardroom my stepsister had spent her entire life assuming would someday be hers, and read a document that was about to make the word useless the single most inaccurate thing anyone had ever said about me. He thought he was leaving behind a woman with no future. He had no idea he was leaving behind the only person in that family who actually had one. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My father built Ferris Industrial Supply from a single distribution warehouse when he was 26 years old, the same age I am now, a fact I've turned over in my mind more than once since learning the rest of this story. By the time I was 7, it had grown into a mid-sized regional company supplying industrial hardware across 3 states, modest by the standards of some of the families in this genre of story, but substantial enough to matter enormously to the people orbiting it. He died when I was 8. A heart condition no one had caught in time, sudden enough that I remember very little of the funeral beyond my mother's hand gripping mine too tightly, as if she thought I might disappear too if she let go. I don't remember much else about him directly. The specific texture of early grief tends to blur details rather than sharpen them, at least in my experience. What I do remember is the quality of how people spoke about him afterward. With real respect, real warmth, the particular reverence reserved for someone who built something honest from nothing and treated the people around him decently while doing it. My mother remarried when I was 10 to a man named Richard, kind enough in his own limited way, who came with a daughter of his own, Vanessa, a year older than me, who'd lost her own mother to illness 2 years earlier. On paper, it should have been a house built on shared grief. 2 children who understood loss meeting each other halfway. It wasn't, not really. Not because Vanessa was cruel exactly, not in those early years. It was subtler than cruelty. It was the accumulation, year after year, of small distinctions that added up to something larger. Richard's attention naturally, understandably, gravitating toward his own biological daughter. My mother, exhausted and grieving in her own right, gradually deferring more and more of the household's emotional energy toward keeping Richard and Vanessa comfortable, perhaps out of some unspoken fear that this marriage, too, might not hold if she didn't manage it carefully. I want to give you concrete examples because I think vague descriptions of favoritism don't capture how insidious it actually is in daily life. Vanessa's school achievements were celebrated with dinners out, photos on the refrigerator, phone calls to relatives. Mine were acknowledged with a nod and a "that's nice, sweetheart" that never quite landed with the same weight. When Vanessa struggled socially in middle school, the household reorganized itself around her comfort. New activities, therapy, careful attention. When I struggled quietly in my own way, in the years following my father's death, I was told gently but firmly to be strong, because Richard already had enough on his plate with Vanessa. By the time we were teenagers, the pattern had fully calcified. Vanessa was the ambitious one, praised for every flicker of interest in Richard's own smaller distribution business, which he ran separately from my father's company, a business my mother had, through her remarriage, gained partial oversight of on my behalf as my father's widow, though I understood almost nothing about the specifics at the time. I was the quiet one. A phrase that started as simple description and slowly hardened into something closer to a diagnosis, an explanation for why I wasn't expected to amount to much of anything in particular. Here's the detail that matters most looking back. My father's company, Ferris Industrial Supply, was never actually merged with Richard's business, despite years of family conversation that treated the two as though they eventually would be. My mother had maintained, through careful trust arrangements set up in the aftermath of my father's death, a controlling interest in Ferris Industrial on my behalf, arrangements I knew almost nothing about, because I was 8 when they were established and no one saw much reason in the years that followed to explain complicated legal trust structures to a grieving child, then a distracted teenager, then a young woman who'd simply absorbed by then that ambition and inheritance were things that happened to other people in this family. Vanessa, meanwhile, spent years explicitly being groomed by Richard for leadership within his own smaller company, language that slowly, subtly, expanded at family gatherings into implications about the family business, more broadly implications no one, including my own mother, ever quite corrected. I met my boyfriend 3 years before that dinner conversation, already carrying 2 decades of quiet diminishment into a relationship that, in hindsight, simply mirrored the family dynamic I'd grown up inside. He was ambitious himself, drawn instinctively to people who projected confidence and direction, qualities Vanessa had spent her whole life performing loudly, and qualities I'd spent my whole life being quietly discouraged from claiming for myself. I loved him, or believed I did, for 3 years, without ever fully understanding that I'd unconsciously built the relationship on the same foundation as my childhood, waiting patiently for someone else's attention to land on me the way it always seemed to land more easily on Vanessa. I had no idea, sitting across from him at increasingly distant dinners in our final months together, that the quiet trust arrangement my mother had maintained since I was 8 years old was about to resurface, in a matter of days, in a way that would make every assumption this family had built about who mattered more entirely, publicly, undeniably wrong. Looking back, I can trace the specific season things shifted between my boyfriend and my stepsister, though I didn't recognize it clearly at the time. It was around the 18-month mark of dating him, coinciding almost exactly with Richard formally announcing at a family dinner that Vanessa would be taking on an official VP of Strategy title within his distribution company, a title that came with a corner office, a modest but real salary, and an entire evening of toasts I sat through quietly, clapping at the appropriate moments. My boyfriend was there that night. I watched him watch her, though I didn't let myself fully register what I was seeing until much later. Something in his posture had shifted, the specific attentiveness people show toward someone they've just recalculated as more significant than they'd previously understood. Over the following year, family gatherings developed a particular rhythm I grew to dread without fully naming why. Vanessa would discuss a new initiative at the company, a negotiation she'd led, a projection she'd made that had proven correct. My boyfriend would ask follow-up questions with genuine interest, the kind of engaged curiosity he'd stopped directing toward my own work months earlier. I worked during this period as a mid-level project coordinator for a nonprofit, meaningful work to me, but the kind of quiet, unglamorous contribution that never generated toasts or corner offices, and increasingly I noticed never generated much interest from him either. I confronted him once gently, about 6 months before the breakup. Not accusing him of anything specific, I didn't yet have anything specific to accuse him of. I simply said I'd noticed he seemed more engaged with Vanessa lately than he used to be with me. "She's just interesting to talk to," he said, and I remember believing him mostly because the alternative felt too painful to sit with directly. I understand now, from conversations I've had since with mutual friends who saw more than I did at the time, that the emotional shift between them had been building quietly for nearly a year before that dinner conversation where he finally said her name aloud. Long lunches that started as catching up since we're basically family. Late-night texts that began as work advice, given his own background in a similar industry, and evolved into something considerably more personal. A slow mutual recognition on both their parts that they found something in each other that felt more alive than what either of them had at home. I want to be honest here, in a way I think this genre of story sometimes isn't. I don't believe my stepsister set out cynically to steal my boyfriend as some calculated act of sibling rivalry. I believe, based on everything I've since learned, that she genuinely fell for him too, the way people sometimes do fall for the wrong person at the wrong time, without fully accounting for who might get hurt in the process. That doesn't excuse what either of them did. It simply makes the betrayal a different shape than pure malice, something closer to two people choosing their own feelings over my heart, repeatedly for the better part of a year, while I remained largely unaware. The final months of my relationship grew colder in ways I attributed at the time to ordinary relationship fatigue rather than what was actually happening. Date nights canceled for work commitments that I now understand were often something else entirely. A distance in his voice on the phone that I chalked up to stress rather than divided attention. Then, for days before that final dinner, my mother called me with news that had nothing to do with my relationship, and everything to do with the 6 days that would follow it. "There's been some paperwork," she said, her voice carrying a specific hesitation I didn't recognize at first. "About your father's company." His original attorney reached out. "Apparently there's a formal review required now that you've turned 26. Some provision in the original trust documents about a transfer of full control at this age. I should have explained all of this to you years ago, honestly. I think I let myself avoid it because it felt easier not to reopen things." I didn't fully understand on that phone call the scope of what she was describing. I understood only that there was a meeting scheduled in 6 days at Ferris Industrial's offices, a meeting my mother described almost apologetically as probably more significant than I've let you believe. I had no idea, hanging up that call, that I would sit through a devastating breakup dinner just 2 days later, absorbing the word useless from a man who had no idea what was quietly waiting for me at the end of that same week. You already witnessed the worst of that dinner, the word useless, delivered with the specific carelessness of a man who'd stopped considering how his words might land. What you didn't see is what happened in the hour after he left. I sat alone at that table for a long time after the door closed behind him, the cold remains of a meal I'd enjoyed 20 minutes earlier still in front of me. I didn't cry, not yet. I sat with a strange, quiet clarity instead, turning that final word over in my mind, useless, and feeling, for the first time in as long as I could remember, something other than the reflexive urge to prove it wrong through effort, through smallness, through trying harder to earn a place I'd been taught to believe I didn't naturally occupy. I thought instead, oddly, about my father, about the little I remembered of him directly, and the considerably more I'd absorbed secondhand, a man who built something honest from nothing at exactly the age I was sitting at that table. I wondered for the first time in years what he might have said to me in that moment, and found myself wishing fiercely that I'd had more time to actually know him rather than simply inherit his absence. The 2 days leading into that boardroom meeting passed in a strange, suspended quality. Grief over the breakup layered awkwardly over a nervous curiosity about whatever my mother had been vague about on the phone. I told no one at work I'd be out. I told no one in the family, aside from my mother, that I even knew the meeting was happening, largely because I still didn't understand its significance enough to know what to say about it. My mother finally explained more fully the night before, sitting across from me at her kitchen table with a folder of documents I'd never seen before. My father, it turned out, had structured Ferris Industrial's ownership carefully in the years before his death, anticipating, perhaps, exactly the kind of blended family complexity that eventually followed. A trust had been established naming me sole beneficial owner of his controlling shares, to be administered by my mother until I turned 26, at which point full transfer of voting control would occur automatically, regardless of any other arrangements the family had informally assumed in the intervening years. "Richard's business," my mother said carefully, "the one Vanessa's been positioned to run, That's always been entirely separate from Ferris Industrial. Richard has never had any ownership stake in your father's company at all. He's simply managed certain operational aspects, informally since our marriage, because I didn't feel equipped to run it myself, and didn't want to disrupt your childhood with those complications. I sat with that for a long moment. Does Vanessa know this? My mother's expression answered before she did. I don't think Richard has ever been entirely honest with her about the difference between his company and yours. The meeting took place on a Thursday morning, in a boardroom I'd visited exactly twice before as a child, memories so faint they felt almost invented rather than remembered. Richard was there. Vanessa was there, dressed sharply, clearly under the impression this was some routine formality related to her own eventual ascension. The attorney, an older man named Mr. Castellano, who'd known my father personally, I learned, opened with a brief, formal explanation of the trust structure, then turned to the actual transfer documents. As of today, he said, full voting control of Ferris Industrial Supply, representing 68% ownership, transfers entirely and irrevocably to the beneficial owner named in the original trust, Ferris's daughter. He looked directly at me. I watched Vanessa's face change in real time, confusion first, then something sharper as she turned to her father. Wait, I thought, you said the company would eventually be. That was never accurate, sweetheart, Richard said quietly, not meeting her eyes. I think I let you believe something I should have corrected a long time ago. Mr. Castellano continued, unbothered by the tension rippling through the room. Given the scope of this transfer, I should note that your father's original documents also included a provision requiring an immediate operational review of any existing management arrangements, which, as I understand it, currently includes Richard's oversight of certain Ferris Industrial operations conducted under an informal arrangement with your mother. I hadn't fully understood, walking into that room, quite how thoroughly my father had planned for this exact moment, years before any of us knew we'd need it. The boardroom didn't empty quickly after Mr. Castellano finished. Richard sat very still, the particular stillness of a man doing rapid math on exactly how much of his own comfortable arrangement was about to unravel. Vanessa, to her credit, didn't erupt the way I might have expected. She simply sat there, absorbing the specific vertigo of learning, in front of witnesses, that an entire assumed future had never actually belonged to her at all. I need to understand this, she said finally, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. You're telling me Dad's business and Ferris Industrial were never actually connected. That everything I've been groomed for was always your father's business, Mr. Castellano said gently, which remains entirely his to pass on however he chooses. This transfer only concerns Ferris Industrial, which was always your stepsister's inheritance, held in trust since she was 8 years old. The provision requiring review of Richard's management arrangement turned out to be more consequential than any of us initially understood. Over the following weeks, as my new legal and financial advisors, provided through the trust's existing structure, examined years of Ferris Industrial's operational records, they identified a pattern that had clearly gone unexamined for years. Richard had been drawing a consulting fee from Ferris Industrial for oversight services that, on closer inspection, amounted to considerably less actual work than the fee justified, alongside several vendor contracts routed through companies with loose, but real ties to his own separate business. I want to be careful here, because I don't believe Richard set out, from the beginning, with cynical intent to defraud a company he was managing on behalf of his stepdaughter. I believe more likely that a gradual informal arrangement, reasonable at first, given genuine oversight responsibilities, had slowly expanded over years into something considerably less defensible, in the specific way unmonitored arrangements sometimes do when no one's paying close enough attention to notice the drift. Regardless of intent, the review required correction. Richard's consulting arrangement was formally terminated. The vendor contracts were renegotiated under proper oversight. None of this was done vindicatively. My new advisors handled it with the same careful procedural neutrality Mr. Castellano had brought to the boardroom itself. But the financial impact on Richard's own business, which had come to depend more heavily than any of us realized on that consulting fee, was significant. I didn't tell my ex-boyfriend any of this directly. I didn't feel any particular obligation to. But news like this doesn't stay contained within a family for long, especially not in the specific social circles where his new relationship with Vanessa had become increasingly public in the weeks following our breakup. I heard secondhand through a mutual friend who still checked in on me occasionally, exactly how the news landed on his end. He'd apparently learned about the trust transfer the same way most of Vanessa's social circle did, through a brief mention in a regional business publication covering the leadership change at Ferris Industrial, my name printed clearly as the company's new owner and CEO. My friend described his reaction, relayed through Vanessa herself in a moment of her own confusion and hurt, as something close to disbelief curdling quickly into shame. He'd left me explicitly for someone with vision and a future people could see, only to learn weeks later that the future he'd actually walked away from had been considerably larger than the one he'd chosen instead. I don't know all the details of what happened between Vanessa and my ex-boyfriend in the aftermath, and I've made a point of not seeking that information out directly. What I do know through the same second-hand channels is that their relationship strained considerably once the full financial impact on Richard's business became clear, Vanessa suddenly finding herself supporting a partner who had explicitly chosen her in part for a status and stability that had turned out to be considerably shakier than either of them had assumed. I felt many things hearing all of this secondhand over those weeks, some vindication, I won't pretend otherwise, but mostly, if I'm honest, I felt a kind of tired clarity. The word useless had never actually been true. It had simply been convenient for a long time for people who benefited from me believing it was. It's been just over a year since that boardroom meeting. I want to tell you honestly what that year actually looked like rather than the tidy montage version. Running Ferris Industrial was at first genuinely overwhelming. I'd spent 26 years being quietly told, in 100 small ways, that ambition and competence weren't naturally mine to claim, and unlearning that, in practice, took considerably longer than any single boardroom reveal could accomplish on its own. I made real mistakes in those first few months. I hired the wrong operations director initially, someone who looked impressive on paper and turned out to be a poor cultural fit. I second-guessed decisions I now, with a year of experience behind me, would make instantly and confidently. But I learned, steadily, unglamorously, the same way my father apparently built the company in the first place, by simply doing the work in front of me, one decision at a time, without waiting for someone else's permission to believe I was capable of it. Ferris Industrial is today in stronger financial health than it's been in nearly a decade, according to the same board members who quietly hadn't expected much from a 26-year-old project coordinator with no prior executive experience. I've expanded 2 of our regional distribution contracts. I've kept deliberately nearly every long-tenured employee my father originally hired, understanding, in a way I don't think I could have without my own years of being overlooked, exactly how much it matters to people to feel genuinely valued rather than simply useful. My mother and Richard's marriage survived the fallout, though not without real strain. I think in an odd way, the whole ordeal forced an honesty into that relationship that had been missing for years, Richard finally acknowledging directly the ways he'd allowed convenient assumptions about the family business to go uncorrected for far too long, at real cost to both his daughter and his stepdaughter's understanding of their own actual futures. My relationship with Vanessa remains complicated, genuinely. We've spoken twice since that boardroom meeting, both conversations careful and somewhat guarded, though not without moments of real, unexpected honesty. She admitted in the second conversation that she'd spent her whole life believing a version of her own future that had never actually been true, built on assumptions her own father had allowed to calcify rather than correct. I don't know if we'll ever be close. I've made peace with that uncertainty. I heard, through the same distant channels, that his relationship with Vanessa ended a few months after mine did with him. Not dramatically, from what I understand, simply worn down by the specific strain of 2 people who'd each, in their own way, been chasing a version of stability that turned out to be built on incomplete information. I don't feel triumphant about that. I mostly feel at this point a genuine indifference that surprised me more than anger ever could have. If you've ever been told, directly or through 1,000 smaller signals, that you're the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one without vision or direction or a future worth taking seriously, I want you to hear this clearly. Other people's assumptions about your potential are not the same thing as the truth of it. Sometimes the people around you simply haven't looked closely enough or haven't wanted to, because your smallness was convenient for the story they were telling about themselves. That doesn't mean the potential wasn't there all along, quietly waiting for its own moment to surface. My ex-boyfriend called me useless at a dinner table, fully convinced he was choosing a better, brighter future by walking away from me. He had no idea, delivering that word so carelessly, that he was describing a version of me that had never actually existed, and that the real version, the one he'd never bothered to truly see, was about to inherit everything he'd assumed belonged to someone else entirely.